Welcome to Untold Stories of Freddie Mercury. If this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And now, let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Ridge Farm Studio in Surrey, creating a rhythmic backdrop that seemed to echo the tension hanging in the air. It was October 1981, and Queen had retreated to this secluded recording facility to work on what would become their 10th studio album, Hot Space. But on this particular evening, the creative energy that usually filled the studio had given way to something far more profound and unsettling. Brian May sat alone in the dimly lit control room, his fingers absently tracing the neck of his red special guitar. The instrument that had helped create some of rock's most iconic anthems now felt heavy in his hands, weighted down by thoughts that had been consuming him for weeks. Outside, the countryside stretched endlessly into darkness, mirroring the uncertainty that had been growing in his mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. The past few years had been a whirlwind of unprecedented success for Queen. Their recent album, The Game, had topped charts worldwide, and their live performances had reached almost mythical status. Yet beneath the glittering surface of fame and adoration, Brian had been wrestling with demons that no amount of applause could silence. The pressure of constant touring, the relentless demands of the music industry, and the weight of expectations from millions of fans had begun to feel suffocating. For months, Brian had been contemplating something that felt almost like betrayal to even think about. The idea had started as a whisper in the back of his mind during their exhausting American tour earlier that year. Night after night, as he stood on stage looking out at seas of faces, he had felt increasingly disconnected from the very thing that had once brought him pure joy. The music that had been his salvation was beginning to feel like a beautiful prison. The studio door opened quietly, and Freddie Mercury entered with his characteristic grace. Though tonight, there was something different about his usual flamboyant energy. Perhaps it was the way he moved more slowly than usual, or how his eyes seemed to search Brian's face with an intensity that suggested he had sensed the turmoil brewing within his longtime friend and collaborator. Freddie had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the emotions of those around him, particularly when it came to his bandmates. Without saying a word, Freddie settled into the chair beside Brian, his presence both comforting and intimidating. The silence between them stretched like a taut string, filled with years of shared experiences, creative triumphs, and the unspoken understanding that had made Queen more than just a band. They were brothers in the truest sense, bound together by their collective passion for pushing musical boundaries and creating something larger than themselves. Brian's hands trembled slightly as he set down his guitar. The weight of what he needed to confess felt enormous, threatening to crush him under its magnitude. For weeks, he had rehearsed this moment in his mind, searching for the right words to express feelings that seemed too complex for language. How could he explain to Freddie, to the man who lived and breathed Queen with every fiber of his being, that he was considering walking away from it all? The fear that had been gnawing at Brian wasn't about failure or criticism, or even the physical demands of their lifestyle. It was something far more fundamental and terrifying. It was the fear that he was losing himself completely, that the person he had been before Queen was disappearing entirely, consumed by the larger-than-life persona that the world expected him to maintain. He feared that if he continued down this path, he would wake up one day and find nothing left of the young astrophysicist who had once dreamed of studying the stars. As the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, Brian took a deep breath and prepared to reveal the truth that had been eating away at him. The moment had arrived when he would have to trust Freddie with his deepest vulnerability, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything between them forever. The silence in the control room had become almost tangible, wrapping around both men like a heavy blanket. Brian could feel his heart hammering against his ribs as he struggled to find the courage to voice what had been tormenting him for months. Freddie remained perfectly still beside him, his usually animated presence subdued to an almost meditative calm, as if he understood that this moment required a different kind of energy than their usual creative sessions. Brian's eyes drifted to the mixing board before them, its countless knobs and sliders representing the technical precision that had always been his domain within Queen. While Freddie commanded the stage with his theatrical brilliance and Roger and John provided the rhythmic foundation, Brian had been the architect of their sound, crafting the layered harmonies and intricate guitar arrangements that had become their signature. Yet tonight, all of that technical mastery felt meaningless in the face of what he needed to express. The guitarist's mind wandered back to his childhood, to the quiet boy who had spent countless hours gazing up at the night sky through his homemade telescope. That young Brian May had dreamed of unlocking the mysteries of the universe, of contributing to humanity's understanding of the cosmos. He had been passionate about science, driven by an insatiable curiosity about the fundamental nature of reality. Music had been a beautiful hobby then, something that brought joy without the crushing weight of expectation. Now, at 34, Brian felt as though he was living someone else's life entirely. The transformation from aspiring astrophysicist to rock star had happened so gradually that he hadn't noticed when the shift became complete. Somewhere along the way, the telescope had been replaced by guitars, the scientific journals by music magazines, and the quiet contemplation of celestial mechanics by the chaos of touring and recording. The success of Queen had exceeded even their wildest dreams, but with that success had come a loss of identity that Brian was only now beginning to fully comprehend. Every interview, every photograph, every public appearance required him to be Brian May the rock star, never just Brian the person. The world saw him as confident, accomplished and living the ultimate fantasy, but inside he felt increasingly hollow, as if the core of who he truly was had been slowly eroded by the demands of fame. Freddie shifted slightly in his chair, and Brian caught a glimpse of his friend's profile in the dim studio lighting. There was something profoundly understanding in Freddie's expression, a recognition that suggested he too had wrestled with similar demons. Perhaps that was why he had chosen this moment to sit quietly beside Brian rather than filling the space with his usual theatrical energy and rapid-fire conversation. The fear that Brian carried wasn't just about losing himself. It was about the possibility that he had already lost himself so completely that there was no way back. He feared that if he tried to return to his scientific pursuits, he would discover that the passion and curiosity that had once driven him were gone forever, casualties of years spent in the spotlight. The thought of being trapped in a life that no longer felt authentic was suffocating, yet the prospect of abandoning everything he and his bandmates had built together felt equally impossible. Brian's hands clenched into fists as he contemplated the magnitude of his dilemma. How could he explain to Freddie that the very success they had worked so hard to achieve had become a prison? How could he make his friend understand that the applause and adoration that seemed to energize Freddie only served to remind Brian of how far he had drifted from his true self? The rain outside had intensified, creating a cocoon of sound that seemed to isolate them from the rest of the world. In this moment, suspended between past and future, Brian knew that he could no longer carry this burden alone. The weight of unspoken words pressed down on Brian's chest like a physical force, making each breath feel labored and deliberate. He found himself studying the familiar calluses on his fingertips, evidence of countless hours spent coaxing melodies from guitar strings. Yet tonight, even these tangible reminders of his musical journey felt foreign to him. The disconnect between his public persona and his inner turmoil had reached a crescendo that could no longer be ignored. Freddie's presence beside him was both comforting and intimidating. Brian knew that his friend possessed an almost supernatural ability to see through facades, to recognize when someone was struggling beneath the surface. It was this very quality that made Freddie such a compelling performer and such a loyal friend, but it also meant that hiding his true feelings had become increasingly impossible. The memories of their early days together flooded back with startling clarity. Brian remembered the excitement he had felt when they first started playing together, the pure joy of creating something beautiful and meaningful with like-minded individuals. Back then, the music had felt like an extension of his scientific curiosity, another way of exploring the fundamental patterns and harmonies that governed the universe. The mathematical precision of chord progressions and the physics of sound waves had fascinated him just as much as the emotional impact of their songs. But somewhere along the journey from small venues to stadium shows, that sense of wonder had been gradually replaced by routine and obligation. The creative process that had once felt like discovery now often felt like manufacturing, producing what was expected rather than what inspired him. The spontaneity and experimentation that had characterized their early work had given way to the pressures of commercial success and the need to satisfy an ever-growing audience. Brian's fear ran deeper than simple career dissatisfaction. He was terrified that he had become a hollow version of himself, going through the motions of being a rock star, while the person he truly was withered away inside. The young man who had once spent hours lost in contemplation of distant galaxies now struggled to find even a few moments of genuine peace and reflection. Every aspect of his life had become public property, scrutinized and analyzed by fans and critics alike. The irony wasn't lost on him that, while Queen's music spoke to millions of people about freedom, love, and authenticity, he felt increasingly trapped and disconnected from his own authentic self. The very songs that had brought joy and meaning to countless lives had become sources of anxiety and self-doubt for their creator. Each performance felt like putting on a mask that grew heavier with each passing show. Freddie remained motionless beside him, his usual restless energy replaced by an almost meditative stillness. Brian sensed that his friend was waiting, creating space for whatever needed to emerge from this moment of profound vulnerability. The trust between them, built over years of shared triumphs and challenges, felt like the only solid ground in an otherwise shifting landscape of uncertainty. The studio around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Brian realized that this moment represented a crossroads, not just for himself, but potentially for Queen as a whole. The decision he was contemplating would affect not only his own future but the lives and careers of three men who had become his brothers. The moment had arrived when silence could no longer serve as refuge. Brian felt something shift inside him, a dam finally giving way under the relentless pressure of months of internal struggle. His hands moved restlessly in his lap as he prepared to voice the fears that had been consuming him, knowing that once the words were spoken, there would be no taking them back. The confession began slowly, almost hesitantly, as Brian found himself describing the growing sense of disconnection he had been experiencing. He spoke about waking up each morning feeling like he was putting on a costume, transforming into a version of himself that the world expected to see. The Brian May that millions of fans adored felt increasingly like a character he was playing rather than who he truly was. Freddie listened with an intensity that was almost palpable, his usual animated expressions replaced by a focused attention that seemed to draw the words from Brian's reluctant lips. There was no judgment in his friend's posture, no hint of the shock or disappointment that Brian had feared might greet his revelation. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like understanding, as if Freddie had been waiting for this conversation for longer than either of them had realized. Brian found himself describing the sleepless nights when he would lie awake questioning everything he had become. He spoke about the moments on stage when he would look out at the sea of faces and feel completely alone, despite being surrounded by thousands of people who were singing along to every word. The applause that should have been validating had begun to feel hollow, a reminder of how far he had drifted from the person he had once been. The fear that Brian had been carrying wasn't just about his career or his identity as a musician. It was about the fundamental question of whether he could ever find his way back to himself, or if the transformation was so complete that the original Brian May had been lost forever. He described the terror of looking in the mirror and seeing a stranger, someone who had achieved everything he had once dreamed of but felt emptier than ever before. As the words poured out, Brian realized that he was describing not just his own experience, but something that he suspected many successful people faced, but rarely discussed. The price of achieving one's dreams, he was learning, could sometimes be the very essence of who you were before those dreams came true. The young astrophysicist who had gazed at stars with wonder and curiosity felt like a distant memory, replaced by someone who barely had time to look up at the sky. Freddie's response, when it finally came, was not what Brian had expected. Rather than trying to talk him out of his feelings or minimize his concerns, his friend seemed to recognize the validity of what he was experiencing. There was a quality to Freddie's attention that suggested he too had wrestled with similar questions about identity and authenticity, though perhaps he had found different ways of reconciling them. The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter, creating a more intimate atmosphere in the studio. Brian felt a strange sense of relief washing over him as he continued to share his deepest fears and uncertainties. For the first time in months, he felt like he was being completely honest about his internal struggle. The atmosphere in the studio had transformed completely. What had begun as a space filled with creative tension had become something resembling a confessional, where two friends could strip away the layers of public persona and speak with raw honesty. Brian felt lighter somehow, as if the act of voicing his fears had begun to diminish their power over him, though the uncertainty about his future remained as pressing as ever. Freddie's response came not in words, but in actions that spoke volumes about the depth of their friendship. He rose from his chair with characteristic grace and moved to the window, gazing out at the rain-soaked countryside. His silhouette against the glass seemed contemplative, almost philosophical, as if he was processing not just Brian's confession, but his own relationship with the complexities of fame and identity. When Freddie finally began to share his thoughts, his voice carried a weight that Brian had rarely heard before. Gone was the theatrical flourish that usually characterized his speech, replaced by something more intimate and genuine. He spoke about his own journey of self-discovery, about the challenges of maintaining authenticity while living in the public eye, and about the constant balancing act between personal fulfillment and professional obligations. What struck Brian most profoundly was Freddie's admission that he too had experienced moments of doubt and disconnection. The man who seemed to embody confidence and self-assurance revealed that he had also struggled with questions about identity and purpose. However, Freddie had found ways to channel those struggles into his art, using the tension between his public and private selves as fuel for creative expression. Freddie described how he had learned to view his stage persona not as a betrayal of his true self, but as an extension of it, a way of exploring different facets of his personality and connecting with audiences on a deeper level. He spoke about the importance of finding moments of genuine connection within the spectacle of performance, and how those moments of authenticity could sustain him through the more challenging aspects of fame. The conversation took an unexpected turn as Freddie began to address Brian's specific fears about losing his scientific identity. Rather than dismissing these concerns, he acknowledged their validity while offering a different perspective. He suggested that Brian's analytical mind and scientific background had always been integral to Queen's sound, contributing to the precision and innovation that set them apart from other bands. Freddie painted a picture of how Brian's dual nature, as both scientist and artist, had enriched their music in ways that might not have been possible otherwise. The mathematical precision of Brian's guitar arrangements, his understanding of acoustics and sound engineering, and his methodical approach to composition had all been shaped by his scientific training. Rather than being separate identities in conflict, perhaps they could be viewed as complementary aspects of the same person. As the evening progressed, Brian began to see his situation from a new angle. Freddie's words helped him recognize that his fear of losing himself might actually be preventing him from fully embracing who he had become. The integration of his scientific and artistic selves didn't have to mean the death of one or the other, but rather the birth of something more complex and complete. The rain had stopped entirely now, leaving behind a crystalline clarity in the air that seemed to mirror the new understanding developing between the two friends. Brian felt something shifting inside him, not a complete resolution of his fears, but the beginning of a different way of thinking about them. The conversation had revealed possibilities he hadn't considered before, ways of moving forward that didn't require abandoning everything he had built. The silence that followed Freddie's words was different from the heavy, oppressive quiet that had filled the room earlier. This was a contemplative silence, pregnant with possibility and new understanding. Brian found himself looking at his hands again, but this time he saw them differently. These weren't just the hands of a rock star going through the motions. They were the hands of someone who had spent years crafting something meaningful, bridging the gap between scientific precision and artistic expression. Freddie had returned to his seat, but his posture had changed. There was something almost paternal in the way he regarded Brian now, as if he was watching a younger brother work through a crucial life lesson. The understanding that passed between them transcended their usual dynamic of creative collaborators and touched something deeper, more fundamental about their friendship and mutual respect. Brian began to process what Freddie had shared with him, particularly the idea that his scientific background hadn't been abandoned but rather transformed into something new. He thought about the countless hours he had spent perfecting guitar tones, analyzing the mathematical relationships between harmonies, and approaching composition with the same methodical precision he had once applied to astrophysical calculations. Perhaps he hadn't lost his scientific identity after all. Perhaps he had simply found a new way to express it. The realization was both liberating and overwhelming. For months, Brian had been viewing his situation as an either-or proposition. He could be a scientist or a musician, but not both. The idea that these aspects of his identity could coexist and even enhance each other had never seriously occurred to him. He had been so focused on what he thought he had lost that he had failed to recognize what he had gained. Freddie's perspective had illuminated something that Brian was only now beginning to understand about the nature of personal growth and evolution. The young man who had gazed at stars through a telescope hadn't disappeared. He had simply found a different way of exploring the universe. Through music, Brian had been able to touch the lives of millions of people, creating moments of transcendence and connection that were perhaps no less meaningful than any scientific discovery. The fear that had been consuming Brian began to transform into something else entirely. What he had interpreted as a loss of identity was actually the natural evolution of someone who had been brave enough to follow multiple passions. The discomfort he had been feeling wasn't necessarily a sign that he was on the wrong path. It might simply be the growing pains that came with integrating different aspects of himself into a more complete whole. Brian found himself thinking about the concept of parallel universes, a topic that had fascinated him during his academic studies. In one universe, perhaps there was a version of himself who had continued down the purely academic path, spending his days in laboratories and lecture halls. But in this universe, he had chosen a different kind of exploration, one that involved mapping the emotional and spiritual territories that music could reveal. The conversation with Freddie had revealed something profound about the nature of authenticity. Brian had been operating under the assumption that being true to himself meant remaining static, unchanging from the person he had been in his youth. But perhaps real authenticity lay in embracing growth and change, in allowing himself to become someone new, while honoring the core values and curiosities that had always driven him. As these thoughts crystallized in his mind, Brian felt a shift in his perspective that was almost physical in its intensity. The weight that had been pressing down on his chest for months began to lift, replaced by something that felt remarkably like hope. He wasn't losing himself. He was discovering new dimensions of who he could be. The studio around them seemed to pulse with renewed energy, as if the space itself was responding to this moment of breakthrough and understanding. The transformation in Brian's understanding had been gradual throughout the evening, but now it crystallized into something concrete and actionable. As he sat in the dimly lit studio, processing everything that had transpired between him and Freddie, he realized that his friend had given him something far more valuable than advice or reassurance. Freddie had provided him with a completely new framework for understanding his identity crisis, one that reframed his fears as opportunities for growth rather than signs of failure. The answer that emerged from their conversation was both simple and profound in its implications. Brian's biggest fear had been that he was losing himself, that the person he had been was disappearing beneath the weight of fame and expectation. But Freddie's perspective had revealed that this fear was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what it meant to be authentic. The answer wasn't to retreat back to who he had been, but to embrace who he was becoming. Brian found himself thinking about the concept of metamorphosis, a process he had studied in the natural sciences. A caterpillar doesn't lose its essential nature when it becomes a butterfly. It fulfills its potential by transforming into something entirely new. Perhaps his journey from astrophysicist to rock star wasn't a betrayal of his true self, but rather the natural evolution of someone who had always been driven by curiosity and the desire to explore the unknown. The moving quality of Freddie's response lay not in any grand gesture or dramatic declaration, but in his quiet recognition of Brian's struggle and his gentle guidance toward a new way of seeing. Freddie had understood that Brian didn't need to be talked out of his feelings or convinced that they were wrong. Instead, he needed to be shown how those very feelings could become the foundation for a more integrated and authentic version of himself. As the night progressed, Brian began to see his situation with remarkable clarity. The disconnection he had been feeling wasn't necessarily a sign that he was on the wrong path. It might simply be an indication that he was ready for the next phase of his evolution. The discomfort of growth was often mistaken for the pain of loss, but they were fundamentally different experiences with very different implications for how one should respond. Brian realized that his scientific training had actually prepared him for this moment in ways he hadn't recognized. Science was fundamentally about questioning assumptions, testing hypotheses, and being willing to revise one's understanding based on new evidence. The evidence of his conversation with Freddie suggested that his fears were based on false premises about the nature of identity and authenticity. The moving answer that Freddie had provided wasn't a solution to Brian's problems, but rather a new way of understanding them. Instead of viewing his dual nature as a source of conflict, he could see it as a unique strength that allowed him to approach music with a perspective that few other artists possessed. His scientific background hadn't been abandoned. It had been transformed into a different kind of tool for exploration and discovery. Brian felt a profound sense of gratitude toward his friend for creating the space for this revelation to emerge. Freddie's willingness to listen without judgment, to share his own vulnerabilities, and to offer a different perspective had been exactly what Brian needed to break through the mental barriers that had been constraining him. The answer had been moving not because it was emotionally manipulative, but because it was genuinely transformative. The studio around them seemed to reflect this new understanding, as if the very air had been cleared of the tension and uncertainty that had filled it earlier. Brian looked at his guitar with fresh eyes, seeing it not as a symbol of compromise or lost dreams, but as an instrument of continued exploration and discovery. The music they would create together wouldn't be a betrayal of his scientific self, but rather an expression of it in a new form. As the evening drew toward its close, Brian understood that he wouldn't be leaving Queen after all. Instead, he would be staying and embracing a more complete version of himself, one that honored both his past and his potential future. The first hints of dawn were beginning to creep through the studio windows when Brian finally felt the last vestiges of his existential crisis dissolve into something resembling peace. The long night of revelation had transformed not just his perspective on his career, but his entire understanding of what it meant to live an authentic life. The fear that had driven him to the brink of leaving everything behind had been replaced by a profound sense of purpose and renewed commitment to the journey he and his bandmates were sharing. Freddie remained beside him, though both men had fallen into a comfortable silence that spoke volumes about the depth of their connection. The conversation had evolved far beyond the initial confession of doubt and uncertainty, becoming something more akin to a philosophical exploration of identity, purpose, and the nature of artistic expression. Brian realized that this night would mark a turning point, not just in his own life, but in his relationship with Queen and everything they represented. The moving quality of Freddie's response had been its complete absence of judgment or pressure. Rather than trying to convince Brian to stay or making him feel guilty about his doubts, Freddie had simply created space for his friend to discover his own truth. This approach had allowed Brian to work through his fears organically, arriving at his own conclusions rather than being persuaded by external arguments. Brian understood now that his crisis had been necessary, even valuable. The discomfort he had experienced over the past months hadn't been a sign that something was wrong with his life, but rather an indication that he was ready to grow into a more complete version of himself. The tension between his scientific and artistic identities hadn't been a problem to be solved, but rather a creative force to be harnessed. As he reflected on the night's revelations, Brian realized that his fear of losing himself had actually been preventing him from fully becoming himself. He had been so focused on preserving an outdated version of his identity that he had been unable to embrace the person he was naturally evolving into. The integration of his scientific background with his musical career wasn't a compromise, but rather a unique synthesis that could produce something entirely new and valuable. The answer that had emerged from their conversation was moving in its simplicity and profundity. Brian didn't need to choose between being a scientist or a musician. He could be both, and in fact, he already was both. His approach to music had always been informed by his scientific training, and his scientific curiosity had found new expression through his artistic endeavors. The perceived conflict had been an illusion created by his own limiting beliefs about what constituted authentic identity. Brian felt a renewed sense of excitement about the future, both for himself and for Queen. The creative possibilities that opened up when he stopped fighting against his dual nature seemed limitless. He could approach their music with the same rigor and curiosity that had once driven his scientific research, while also allowing himself to be moved by the emotional and spiritual dimensions of artistic expression. The studio around them seemed to pulse with potential energy, as if it too was responding to this moment of breakthrough and renewal. Brian picked up his guitar once more, but this time it felt different in his hands. It was no longer a symbol of compromise or lost dreams, but rather an instrument of continued exploration and discovery. The music they would create together would be informed by everything he had learned and experienced, both as a scientist and as an artist. As the sun began to rise over the Surrey countryside, Brian knew that he would not be leaving Queen. Instead, he would be staying and embracing a more integrated version of himself, one that honored both his intellectual curiosity and his artistic passion. The fear that had nearly driven him away had ultimately led him to a deeper understanding of who he truly was and what he was meant to contribute to the world. The moving answer that Freddie had provided wasn't just about staying with the band. It was about staying true to the fullness of his own potential. Brian May, the astrophysicist, and Brian May, the rock star, weren't separate people in conflict, but rather different facets of the same complex, evolving human being who had found his unique way of exploring the mysteries of existence. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming emotional and inspiring tales about Freddie's life and legacy. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and often your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.